Isabel never expected her life to turn out this way, bound by a family alliance to a stranger named Jared, whose face she can barely recall after a year of marriage. Stuck in an unfulfilled relationship, she's resigned to a life without love. But everything changes when she meets Lorenzo Bellini, her charming and enigmatic boss. In the high-stakes world of corporate power and ambition, Lorenzo is everything she's ever dreamed of: compassionate, daring, and magnetic. Slowly, she finds herself drawn to him, experiencing a spark that her marriage has never kindled. Torn between duty to her family and a newfound longing, Isabel faces an impossible choice: loyalty to a husband she hardly knows or risking everything to pursue a forbidden love. As Isabel's heart pulls her closer to Lorenzo, secrets and hidden identities weave a web around her, and every decision brings her closer to an unraveling she never saw coming. Will she find the courage to follow her heart, or will the shadows of her past keep her from true happiness? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Isabel stared at the delicate band of gold on her finger, its shine dulled from lack of wear. Though she'd been married to Jared for nearly a year, it still felt foreign on her hand, like a piece of jewelry borrowed for a special event, only to be stashed away after. Marriage, she thought, should mean sharing a life, waking up each morning to the warmth of a loved one beside her, someone who saw her for who she was, flaws and all. Yet her reality was far from that. Her marriage to Jared had been arranged by her family, a bond sealed by alliances and whispered promises between two influential families. Isabel could still remember the day her parents told her about the engagement. Their voices had brimmed with excitement, oblivious to the hesitation written across her face. It was, as her mother had put it, a perfect match, a union that would bring strength and respect to both families. They had assured her that love would follow in time, just as it had for generations past, but a year in, love felt more like a distant hope than an inevitable outcome. Jared had seemed kind enough on the day of their wedding, though he'd kept his distance, even then. There were no vows exchanged with trembling voices, no secret glances filled with affection. Their wedding had been grand, orchestrated down to the finest detail by their families, but it had lacked the one thing Isabel had longed for: a genuine connection. After the wedding, she and Jared barely saw each other. His work took him away frequently, he said, though he never shared the specifics of it with her. She knew little about what he did, and the mystery only added to the growing chasm between them. Weeks often passed without a word, save for polite, clipped messages about scheduling or appearances they were expected to make. Isabel found herself growing accustomed to his absence, his silent presence a weight she carried, even when he was miles away. Her life had fallen into a rhythm of solitude, punctuated by brief family gatherings where they had to pretend for the sake of their parents and friends. Those were the only times Jared felt like her husband, an actor stepping into his role on cue, with Isabel playing the quiet, obliging wife beside him. In moments like these, Isabel would find herself retreating to memories of her younger self, full of dreams of romance and connection, a love so consuming it would feel like a fairy tale come to life. How naive she had been, she thought, to believe such a thing could be hers. The young girl who once believed in love at first sight seemed to belong to a different lifetime altogether, a person Isabel could hardly recognize. Still, as much as she tried to quell it, the loneliness crept in at unexpected times. Late at night, when the apartment was silent and the city lights twinkled outside her window, she'd wonder what it would be like to share her life with someone who actually knew her. Someone who looked at her with warmth and not indifference, who held her close at the end of a long day. She found herself yearning for connection, a simple conversation that went beyond the transactional exchanges she'd grown accustomed to with Jared. One evening, as she sat alone in the spacious living room, Isabel decided to look at their wedding photos. She hadn't revisited them since the day they arrived from the photographer. She expected to see the carefully curated images of them posing together, smiling for the camera. But what she hadn't expected was the hollow look in her own eyes, the stiffness in Jared's posture as he stood beside her. They looked like strangers dressed up for someone else's wedding. With a sigh, she closed the photo album and leaned back, wondering if this was all her life would ever be: a series of well-rehearsed lies told to appease their families, a marriage built on convenience rather than affection. She couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment towards the arrangement, the way it had stolen her freedom to find love on her own terms. Isabel's mind wandered to her job, the one place where she felt like herself. As an executive assistant to one of the most dynamic CEOs in the industry, her days were busy, and she was valued for her insights and efficiency. It was the one area of her life where she felt in control, where her skills mattered and her presence was acknowledged. Work had become her escape, a place where she didn't feel like just someone's wife or a pawn in her family's strategic alliances. But as much as she appreciated her career, it wasn't enough to fill the void in her heart. She wanted more than just a successful career and a convenient marriage. She wanted laughter, warmth, someone who would challenge her and stand by her side through all of life's twists and turns. Yet, with each passing day, that dream seemed more like a distant fantasy, something out of reach for someone like her. Just as she was lost in thought, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, half hoping it might be Jared, perhaps reaching out with a rare attempt at connection. But it was only a notification from her family's group chat, a reminder about an upcoming family gathering. The familiar pang of obligation twisted in her chest. Another event where she and Jared would have to act the part of a happily married couple, smiling and exchanging pleasantries as though their lives were filled with joy and companionship. Isabel sighed, feeling the weight of her double life settle over her once again. But as she looked out over the city lights, a small ember of hope flickered in her heart. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for her to find the connection she longed for, even if it meant defying the carefully constructed expectations that surrounded her. With a sense of quiet determination, Isabel resolved to take control of her happiness. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she would no longer be content with a life half-lived. The next morning, Isabel stepped into the gleaming glass tower of Bellini Enterprises, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Work was the one place where she felt truly in control, where she could leave behind the role of dutiful wife and focus on something that was hers alone. Today, she was more eager than usual to immerse herself in her tasks. A new project was underway, and with it, a chance to make a strong impression on the team. Bellini Enterprises had grown in recent years into one of the most influential companies in the country, and at its helm was none other than the CEO himself, Lorenzo Bellini. Isabel had heard stories of Lorenzo's rise to power, a young, ambitious black man who had taken the company to unprecedented heights with his relentless drive and sharp mind. But despite his formidable reputation, he remained a mystery to most of the employees. Lorenzo was notoriously private, rarely seen outside his executive meetings, and almost never involved in the day-to-day operations at her level. As Isabel made her way to her desk, she glanced at the agenda her supervisor had emailed the team the night before. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Lorenzo's name listed as the lead for today's project briefing. This would be her first time seeing him up close, and she couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. The office buzzed with similar anticipation, whispers exchanged about Lorenzo's presence among the employees. Just before 10, Isabel joined her colleagues in the boardroom, her pulse quickening as she took her seat. The room fell silent as Lorenzo walked in, his confident strides echoing in the spacious room. Tall, with a striking presence and an intensity that seemed to command respect effortlessly, he wore a tailored charcoal suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. His deep, rich voice filled the room as he greeted the team with a brief nod before launching into the project details. As most of you know, this new initiative is crucial to our upcoming quarter, Lorenzo began, his gaze sweeping the room. We're venturing into new territory, and I'll be relying on each of you to bring your best to the table. Isabel found herself captivated by his presence. Lorenzo spoke with a mix of authority and passion, his words fueled by a clear sense of purpose. His charisma was undeniable, but it was more than that. He carried himself with a self-assuredness that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter, listen a little harder. Isabel tried to focus on taking notes, but her attention kept drifting back to him. It was rare to meet someone with that level of intensity, someone who could command a room with a simple glance. Halfway through the meeting, Lorenzo turned his gaze directly on her. Isabel's breath caught as his dark, piercing eyes met hers. "Isabel, right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She swallowed, forcing herself to nod. "Yes, sir." Lorenzo gave her a slight, approving smile. "I read through your recent reports. Impressive work. I'd like you to take on a more active role in this project moving forward." A mix of surprise and pride washed over her. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." I expect nothing less. His words were straightforward, but there was a warmth in his tone that surprised her. He moved on to address the rest of the team, leaving Isabel to process the unexpected compliment. For the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely seen, recognized for her skills and hard work. It was a stark contrast to the polite indifference she was used to from Jared. As the meeting wrapped up, Lorenzo remained behind and Isabel found herself lingering at her seat. She hesitated, but something compelled her to approach him. She took a breath, steadying her nerves, before speaking. "Thank you again for the opportunity, Mr. Bellini. I appreciate your confidence in me." Lorenzo looked up from his notes, his expression softening. "Please call me Lorenzo, and thank you, Isabel. Your work speaks for itself." The casual use of her name felt oddly intimate, a break from the formality that surrounded them in the office. Isabel nodded, a slight smile on her lips. "All right, Lorenzo, I'm excited to contribute." He studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, ambition is a rare trait. Most people go through the motions, but I can tell you have more in you. Don't lose that drive." The comment left her slightly taken aback. Lorenzo had barely known her for an hour, yet he seemed to recognize a part of her that few others saw. It felt unsettling, but also thrilling, like he had peeled back a layer of her carefully constructed exterior and glimpsed the real her beneath. She thanked him again, and with a respectful nod, she left the boardroom, her heart racing. As she walked back to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that today marked the beginning of something new. Her life had been so tightly controlled by the expectations of others, her family, her marriage, that she had forgotten what it felt like to chase something purely for herself. But now, under Lorenzo's watchful gaze, she felt inspired to give more, to push herself in ways she hadn't dared to before. For the rest of the day, Isabel found herself carrying a renewed sense of purpose, an energy that extended beyond her typical diligence. She dived into her tasks with a focus she hadn't felt in months, each email and document bearing a personal mark of pride. The hours flew by, and as she packed up to leave, she couldn't help but replay the brief moments she'd shared with Lorenzo in the boardroom. That evening, as she returned to the quiet, empty apartment, Isabel found herself thinking about him again. Lorenzo was unlike anyone she'd ever met, strong, confident, yet also perceptive in a way that unsettled her. She barely knew him, yet he'd managed to ignite something within her, a spark she hadn't felt in ages. As she stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Isabel's mind drifted back to the image of Lorenzo's intense gaze, the way he'd spoken her name like a promise. She didn't know what this feeling was, whether it was simply admiration or the start of something far more complicated. But for the first time since her wedding day, she felt as though her life was moving, like she was finally stepping out of the shadows of duty and into the light of possibility. Isabel's days quickly settled into a new rhythm after that project briefing. Each morning, she arrived at the office with a newfound excitement, her mind buzzing with ideas for the project. Lorenzo had kept his promise of involving her more directly, and she found herself in his office frequently, discussing strategies and brainstorming with him. Each meeting gave her a glimpse into his mind, the way he thought through challenges and tackled obstacles with a level-headed intensity that she couldn't help but admire. One Friday evening, as the office was winding down and most employees had already left for the weekend, Isabel found herself still at her desk, absorbed in last-minute adjustments to the project presentation she'd be delivering on Monday. The quiet of the empty office wrapped around her, broken only by the soft hum of the computer screen. She leaned closer to the monitor, double-checking a spreadsheet, when a low, familiar voice broke the silence. "Still here?" She looked up, surprised to see Lorenzo standing a few feet away, his hands casually in his pockets. His suit jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms, a sight she found unexpectedly disarming. She smiled, a bit embarrassed. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready for Monday's presentation. It's ... a big one," she replied, trying to hide the flush that crept into her cheeks. He nodded approvingly, moving closer until he was leaning slightly against the edge of her desk. "You're dedicated. That's rare these days." She shrugged, attempting to brush off the compliment. "I just want to do a good job. I feel like this project is an important one for the company." He studied her with that piercing gaze that always seemed to see right through her. "It is. And I appreciate the work you're putting into it, Isabel. You're talented. You don't need to push yourself to prove that." His words caught her off guard, She wasn't used to someone noticing her efforts, let alone valuing them. "Thank you. I guess it's easy to get caught up in wanting to ... make a difference." Lorenzo's expression softened. "I understand that more than you know." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's late. Let me take you out for a quick coffee, just as a thanks for all your hard work." Isabel hesitated, caught off guard by his invitation. It was a simple gesture, yet the thought of sharing a moment outside the walls of the office felt almost intimate. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sure, I could use a break." They left the quiet office building together, stepping out into the crisp evening air. Lorenzo led her to a small cafe just around the corner, one of those tucked-away places with warm lights and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. They found a table by the window, and as they settled into their seats, Isabel felt a strange sense of ease. The roles of CEO and employee seemed to dissolve here, replaced by the simpler identities of two people sharing a moment over coffee. As they sipped their drinks, Lorenzo asked her about her life outside of work. Isabel found herself opening up more than she'd expected, sharing stories from her past and talking about her family, though she carefully avoided mentioning her marriage. He listened with genuine interest, his eyes never leaving hers, and she felt an odd warmth in the way he responded, his words carrying a weight that hinted at shared understanding. Eventually, the conversation shifted back to him, and Isabel took the opportunity to ask him about his journey to becoming CEO. "I imagine it couldn't have been easy, building something like Bellini Enterprises from the ground up," she remarked. Lorenzo's gaze grew distant for a moment, as if remembering the long nights and the struggles he'd faced along the way. "No, it wasn't," he admitted, his voice softer. "It was a lot of work. A lot of sacrifices. But I've always believed that if you want something badly enough, you have to be willing to give it everything." Isabel nodded, feeling a pang of admiration. "That's inspiring. I think a lot of people would have given up along the way." He chuckled, a trace of humility in his smile. "There were moments when I thought about it, but then I remembered why I started in the first place, and that kept me going." They continued talking, the conversation flowing naturally, and before Isabel realized it, over an hour had passed. She glanced at her watch, surprised by how quickly the time had flown. "I didn't realize it was so late," she said, half laughing. Lorenzo smiled, a look of genuine enjoyment in his eyes. "Time has a way of slipping away when the company's good." He paused, his gaze meeting hers with a warmth that sent a gentle flutter through her. "I'm glad you came, Isabel." She felt her cheeks warm again, her heart beating a little faster under his gaze. "Me too," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. They walked back to the office building in comfortable silence, the night air crisp around them. When they reached the entrance, Lorenzo turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Isabel, people often get caught up in the idea of success, but I think fulfillment comes from the connections we make along the way." His words lingered in the air between them, resonating with a depth that struck something inside her. She looked up at him, seeing the man behind the title of CEO, someone who understood the weight of ambition and the cost it sometimes demanded. For a fleeting moment, she felt as if they were kindred spirits, each striving for something meaningful in a world that often seemed cold and indifferent. "Well," she said, trying to hold on to that moment, "thank you again for the coffee ... and for the company." Lorenzo smiled, his gaze lingering just a second longer than usual. "Anytime. Have a good night, Isabel." As he disappeared into the night, Isabel found herself standing there, feeling a strange mixture of exhilaration and confusion. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this way, her heart stirred by something beyond duty and obligation. This quiet connection they had shared felt fragile, like a secret that she wanted to hold close. She made her way home, the memory of Lorenzo's words echoing in her mind. Connection. The very thing she had longed for in her own marriage, and yet, here it was, catching her off guard in the most unexpected of places. She knew it was dangerous to entertain these thoughts, to let herself feel anything for a man who wasn't her husband. And yet, she couldn't deny the spark that had ignited within her, a small flame that illuminated the emptiness she had carried for so long. As she lay in bed that night, staring up at the dark ceiling, Isabel knew that something had shifted. It was a subtle change, something she could barely grasp, but it was there, a glimmer of hope, a possibility. For the first time in a long while, she felt as if she were standing at the edge of something new, something that might just lead her toward the happiness she had yearned for all along. The following Monday morning, Isabel arrived at the office early, anticipation humming beneath her usual calm exterior. Today, she'd be presenting the project updates to Lorenzo and the team, a presentation she had spent hours perfecting over the weekend. She had reviewed each slide a dozen times, ensuring every detail was polished. Yet her excitement wasn't solely about the presentation. A part of her, one she barely admitted even to herself, looked forward to seeing him again. As the team gathered in the boardroom, Isabel took her place at the front of the room, setting up her laptop and projector. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, sensing the unspoken curiosity. After all, it wasn't every day that a CEO took a particular interest in an assistant's work. But Isabel brushed off their glances, focusing instead on the steps of her presentation. The room quieted as Lorenzo entered, his presence commanding as always. He took a seat at the head of the table, nodding toward Isabel in encouragement. Her pulse quickened as she began to speak, her voice steady but her heart racing. She walked them through each slide with precision, summarizing the key points and addressing the team's questions confidently. As the presentation drew to a close, Isabel glanced at Lorenzo. He was watching her with an intensity that made her feel as if they were the only two people in the room. When she finished, he nodded approvingly, a slight smile gracing his features. "That was thorough and impressive," Isabel, Lorenzo said, his voice warm with approval. "Your analysis on market trends was especially insightful. I appreciate the effort and detail you put into this." Isabel felt a rush of pride. "Thank you, Lorenzo. I'm glad you found it useful." The other team members began to chime in with their comments, discussing the next steps. But Isabel was only half listening, her mind still lingering on Lorenzo's praise. As the team finalized the meeting notes and began filing out of the boardroom, Lorenzo approached her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you have a moment, Isabel?" he asked, his tone casual yet personal. "Of course," she replied, her curiosity piqued. He led her to his office, a spacious, modern room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Lorenzo gestured for her to sit as he took the chair across from her, a slight air of relaxation replacing his usual businesslike demeanor. "I wanted to talk to you about expanding your role in the project," he began, his eyes meeting hers. "I think you have a unique perspective that could benefit us if you're willing to take on more responsibility." Isabel blinked, momentarily taken aback. She hadn't expected this. "I love that," she said, her excitement barely contained. "Good," he replied, nodding. "I had a feeling you would. I'll need someone with initiative, someone who isn't afraid to make bold decisions. I think you could be that person." Her mind raced, already envisioning the possibilities. It was the first time someone in authority had shown such confidence in her abilities. Jared had always made her feel like her dreams and ambitions were trivial, but here was Lorenzo, a man who barely knew her personally, entrusting her with a meaningful role. He leaned back slightly, studying her with a look that was hard to decipher. "I'm interested in your thoughts, Isabel. What drives you? What is it that you're looking for here or in life?" The question was unexpected, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. "I guess I want to make an impact," she admitted slowly, her voice quiet. "I've always felt that there's more to life than just going through the motions. I want to do something that matters, something that lets me use my abilities in a meaningful way." He nodded, as if he understood completely. "Ambition and purpose, two things that can carry a person far," he said, "but they also require sacrifice." His words hung in the air, resonating with something deep within her. She thought of her marriage to Jared, the life she'd resigned herself to, the dreams she'd put aside for the sake of family expectations. In this moment, sitting across from Lorenzo in his sunlit office, she felt the weight of those sacrifices pressing down on her, but she also felt an unspoken encouragement in his gaze. "You know, Isabel, I think you'll go far," he continued. "There's something about you that stands out." A slight blush crept up her cheeks, and she forced herself to hold his gaze, feeling a surge of gratitude she couldn't fully express. "Thank you, Lorenzo. That means a lot to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken understanding. For the first time, Isabel felt seen in a way that went beyond her professional abilities. Lorenzo had a way of looking at her that felt oddly personal, as though he understood not just her potential, but her struggles as well. It was a connection she hadn't expected, and one she wasn't sure how to interpret. Lorenzo cleared his throat, bringing the moment back to business. "Well, I'll have my assistant send over the details for your expanded role," he said, slipping back into his role as CEO. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you'll bring to this project." She smiled, nodding. "I won't let you down." As she left his office, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling of exhilaration that followed her back to her desk. Her mind replayed their conversation, lingering on his words and the way he had looked at her. There was something there, a spark that went beyond professionalism, a connection that felt dangerously close to crossing boundaries. She knew she should ignore it, bury it beneath her work and her obligations. But the more time she spent around him, the harder it became to deny. In the following days, Isabel threw herself into her expanded responsibilities, determined to prove herself. The project moved forward smoothly, and her confidence grew with each success. Lorenzo continued to check in with her, his encouragement steady and genuine, and their interactions became a cherished part of her day. She began to look forward to those moments, the brief but electric exchanges that left her heart racing and her mind clouded with questions she dared not ask. One afternoon, as they reviewed a new set of proposals, their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same folder. Isabel felt a spark shoot up her arm, and she quickly withdrew her hand, glancing up to see if he had noticed. His gaze met hers, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes, and for a brief second, the world around them seemed to fade away. "Isabel," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of hesitation, "you're quite remarkable. I don't think I've told you that enough." Her breath caught, and she forced herself to look away, the words both thrilling and terrifying. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. As she returned to her work, Isabel felt her mind whirling, her emotions a tangled mix of excitement and confusion. She knew the feelings growing within her were dangerous, that this attraction, whatever it was, could complicate her life in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. There was something about Lorenzo, something magnetic and compelling that kept drawing her in. She knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, but for the first time in her life, the risk felt worth it. The seeds of connection had been sown, and with each passing day they took root, spreading deeper into her heart, despite the impossible situation she found herself in. Days turned into weeks, and the project took on a life of its own, with Isabel at its center. The late nights at the office, working side by side with Lorenzo, had become a routine she anticipated with an eagerness that startled her. She had started noticing the small details, the way he rolled up his sleeves as the hours wore on, the subtle expressions that crossed his face when he concentrated, the rare but warm smiles he offered when she shared an idea he appreciated. One evening, as Isabel was compiling reports in her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Lorenzo. "In the break room. Thought you could use a coffee." Isabel smiled at the text, her heart fluttering slightly. She grabbed her notebook, making her way to the break room. When she arrived, she found Lorenzo pouring coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. The warm scent filled the small room, adding a coziness to the otherwise sterile office setting. "Here," he said, handing her a mug, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. "Figured you could use the energy boost." "Thank you," she replied, feeling the slight warmth of his touch linger even after he'd pulled away. She took a sip, savoring the rich aroma. "I think this project has officially turned me into a caffeine addict." Lorenzo laughed softly, the sound genuine and relaxed. "Welcome to my world," he said, leaning against the counter. "Late nights, long hours. Sometimes coffee is the only thing that keeps you sane." Isabel smiled, watching him over the rim of her mug. "Well, I suppose there are worse habits to have." They stood in a comfortable silence, the low hum of the vending machine the only sound in the room. Isabel's thoughts wandered to her life outside of work, where her marriage to Jared loomed like an unspoken secret she kept from Lorenzo and her colleagues. Here, in the quiet bubble of the break room with Lorenzo, that life felt like a distant world, one that belonged to someone else entirely. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. She pushed it away, focusing instead on the moment, on Lorenzo's steady presence and the warmth in his gaze. They had settled into an easy rhythm, a connection that felt natural, and as the weeks had passed, that connection had deepened into something she could no longer ignore. "Isabel," Lorenzo said, his voice low, breaking through her thoughts, "you've been invaluable to this project. I don't know if I've told you that enough." His words caught her off guard, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Lorenzo. I've enjoyed working on it, especially with you." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Likewise. It's rare to find someone who has the same drive and dedication. You make it look effortless." The compliment made her heart skip a beat. She looked down, feeling her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "It doesn't always feel that way," she admitted, her voice soft. Sometimes sometimes it feels like I'm just running, trying to prove something. To myself, maybe." He studied her for a moment, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "It's easy to get lost in the pursuit, to forget why you started in the first place." She glanced up, caught by the sincerity in his voice. "How do you remember?" He hesitated, his gaze softening. "You remind yourself of what matters. The people who believe in you, the things that make you feel alive." His voice grew even quieter. "Moments like this." For a moment they stood there, the space between them charged with an unspoken energy. Isabel felt her pulse quicken, and she knew she was on dangerous ground. She should have stepped back, reminded herself of the boundaries she'd promised to respect. But standing here, with Lorenzo looking at her in a way that made her feel seen in a way Jared never had, she felt her resolve slipping. "Lorenzo," she began, her voice faltering. But he didn't let her finish. "Isabel, there's something about you. Something I can't ignore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Her breath caught, and she felt her heart racing. She wanted to respond, to tell him she felt the same, but the weight of her marriage held her back. She looked away, struggling to find the words. I don't know if this is," she trailed off, the words lost as she tried to reconcile her feelings with the reality of her situation. Lorenzo seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a step back, giving her the space she needed, though the warmth in his gaze remained. "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Isabel. I just needed you to know." She nodded, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She was grateful for his understanding, but it only deepened the ache she felt, the longing for something she couldn't have. The truth was, she had felt more alive in these past weeks with Lorenzo than she had in her entire year with Jared. Her marriage felt like an obligation, a role she played out of duty rather than love, and the thought of going back to that emptiness filled her with a quiet despair. That night, Isabel left the office with a heavy heart. She walked through the city streets, her thoughts tangled and chaotic. She knew she was at a crossroads, that whatever choice she made would alter the course of her life. But the decision wasn't as simple as walking away from one life and stepping into another. There were expectations, family loyalties, and promises she had made, even if those promises felt hollow now. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Isabel's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jared, a rare message informing her that he would be out of town for the rest of the week on a business trip. There was no warmth in his words, no indication that he'd even thought about her until he needed to communicate his absence. A strange mix of relief and sadness washed over her. Jared's absence had long been a part of her life, but tonight it felt different. Tonight she saw it for what it was, a void, an absence of something essential, something she could never truly find with him. Later, as she lay in bed, Isabel stared at the ceiling, her mind drifting back to Lorenzo's words, his gaze, the unspoken promise that had hung between them. The emptiness beside her felt more pronounced than ever, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to fill it with someone who truly saw her, who valued her, who wanted her not as an obligation, but as a partner. The realization stirred something within her, a quiet but powerful need to break free, to seek the happiness she had always believed was out of reach. She didn't know what the future held, or what choices lay ahead, but one thing was clear: she couldn't keep living a life half-lived. The connection she felt with Lorenzo was real, undeniable, and it had awakened a desire she could no longer suppress. The next morning, Isabel awoke with a familiar sense of dread pressing down on her. It was a feeling she'd learned to ignore over the past year, but today it felt heavier, as if her heart was rebelling against the choices she'd made. Her interactions with Lorenzo had stirred emotions she hadn't known she was capable of, emotions she thought she had buried long ago under the weight of her family's expectations and her quiet marriage to Jared. Arriving at the office, Isabel tried to push away the thoughts that had kept her up most of the night. She poured herself into her work, the hours passing in a blur of reports, emails, and meetings. But despite her best efforts, her mind kept drifting back to Lorenzo, to the way he looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name, the way he'd made her feel alive, wanted, and seen. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she felt at home, where Jared's absence had become more constant than his presence. By midday, Isabel's concentration was broken by a message from her mother, a reminder about the family dinner plan for that weekend. Her mother's words carried an unspoken expectation she and Jared were expected to attend together to maintain the image of a perfect marriage, a union that strengthened both their families. Isabel sighed, her chest tightening at the thought of the evening a charade where she would have to pretend that her marriage was something more than a hollow commitment. That evening, Isabel returned to her empty apartment, the silence feeling more oppressive than usual. She glanced at the few photos on the mantel, images of her and Jared on their wedding day, smiles carefully posed for the camera. She remembered how surreal it had felt, standing beside a man she barely knew, swearing vows that felt more like a script than a promise. Jared had played his part flawlessly, the model husband when the occasion called for it, but when the guests left and the lights dimmed, he was just a stranger sharing her home. Sighing, she poured herself a glass of wine and sank onto the couch. She tried to focus on the plans for the weekend's family gathering, on the outfits she'd need to prepare, but her mind kept returning to Lorenzo. Every interaction with him had chipped away at the walls she'd built around her heart, exposing the loneliness and longing she had buried beneath layers of duty. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, pulling her back to reality. Startled, she glanced at the clock, wondering who would be visiting at this hour. Setting her glass down, she crossed the room and opened the door, only to find Jared standing there, a briefcase in one hand and a distracted look on his face. "Jared," she said, surprised. I didn't expect you back so soon." He shrugged, stepping inside without meeting her eyes. "The meeting finished early. Thought I'd come home instead of staying another night at the hotel." She stepped aside, closing the door as he moved past her, his focus already shifting to his phone. Watching him, she felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing a scene from someone else's life. Jared didn't ask about her day or even acknowledge her with more than a brief nod. He was physically there, but his presence felt as empty as the silence that filled their home. As he set his things down, she gathered the courage to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Jared, do you ever ... do you ever wonder if this is really working? I mean." He paused, finally looking up from his phone, his brow furrowing in mild confusion. "What do you mean?" She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "It's just, we barely see each other. We don't talk. Sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions." Jared's expression remained impassive, and he sighed, glancing away. "Isabel, you know this arrangement was never meant to be about romance. Our families made a deal. We're fulfilling that agreement. Why complicate things?" His words stung, though they shouldn't have. She'd known from the beginning what this marriage was, what was expected of her. But hearing it so bluntly, the emptiness of his response made her chest ache. "Is that all this is to you? An arrangement?" He shrugged, a trace of impatience in his voice. "What else would it be? I thought we both understood that. Look, Isabel, I don't want to argue about this. We have a family dinner this weekend. Let's just keep things as they are." She nodded, forcing herself to accept his answer. He turned and disappeared into his study, leaving her standing alone in the entryway, her heart heavy with a sadness she couldn't shake. She had always known Jared was distant, emotionally unavailable, but tonight, his words felt like a door closing, a reminder that her dreams of love and connection had no place in this marriage. As she returned to her wine, her mind drifted back to Lorenzo. His words, his warmth, his understanding, all of it felt like a balm to the wounds she carried. She could still feel the way he looked at her, the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces inside her. It was dangerous, these thoughts of him, and yet she couldn't deny how much she longed for that connection, for something real, something that made her feel alive. The days leading up to the family dinner passed in a haze, and by the time the evening arrived, Isabel felt like she was moving on autopilot. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress that conveyed the polished image expected of her. Jared was by her side, his expression neutral, his suit impeccable as always. Together they looked the part of a perfect couple, but Isabel felt the emptiness pressing down on her, a suffocating weight that grew heavier with every forced smile and polite conversation. Throughout the evening, Isabel played her part, nodding and smiling as her family and Jared's exchanged stories and pleasantries. But her mind kept drifting to Lorenzo, to the life she'd glimpsed in his presence, a life filled with purpose and meaning, a life where she wasn't simply someone's wife but a woman in her own right. As the evening drew to a close, her mother pulled her aside, her voice filled with the familiar pride and expectations that had shaped Isabel's life. "You're doing wonderfully, Isabel. Your father and I are so proud of you, of the way you uphold our family's name." Isabel forced a smile, nodding, but inside her heart felt as though it were fracturing. She couldn't bear the weight of these expectations, the endless cycle of duty that had trapped her in a marriage devoid of love. She longed for the freedom to choose, to live a life that was hers alone. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside Jared, who had already fallen asleep, Isabel stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Lorenzo. She knew the risks, the complications, but the pull she felt toward him was undeniable. It was as though her heart was divided between the life she was expected to live and the life she yearned for. And for the first time, Isabel found herself questioning which one she truly wanted. The following week, Isabel sat alone in her office, her mind drifting back to the family dinner and Jared's indifferent response to her questions. The emptiness of their marriage weighed on her, deepening the ache she felt whenever she thought of Lorenzo. She knew it was foolish to let her thoughts linger on him, but she couldn't help herself. He had shown her a version of herself she had nearly forgotten, a woman with dreams, ambitions, and the desire to be truly known. That evening, as Isabel prepared to leave for the day, her phone buzzed with a message from Lorenzo. "Are you still at the office? Can we talk?" Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly replied, letting him know she was still there. A few minutes later, she heard a knock on her door, and Lorenzo stepped in, his expression unusually serious. She stood up, surprised to see the slight tension in his posture. "Lorenzo, is everything all right?" she asked, concern filling her voice. He nodded, offering a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, everything's fine. I wanted to talk to you about something." They both sat down, and for a moment, Lorenzo was quiet, his gaze fixed on the floor as though gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, laced with a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "I don't talk about my past very often," he began, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "But sometimes, certain things resurface. And lately I've been thinking about choices I made, things I sacrificed." Isabel felt a pang of empathy, her heart reaching out to him. She could sense the weight of whatever he was carrying, and it made her want to listen, to be there for him in a way that went beyond the boundaries of work. "I'm here, Lorenzo," she said gently. "If you want to share, I'll listen." He hesitated, and then, as if deciding to let down his guard, he began to speak. "When I first took over this company, I was driven, maybe too driven. I thought I had to prove myself, that I had to be better, stronger, more successful than anyone who came before me. I pushed myself hard, and I pushed away people who cared about me. Friends, family, even someone I loved." Isabel listened intently, her heart aching at the sadness in his voice. She'd seen the confident, composed side of Lorenzo, the man who commanded respect effortlessly. But now she was seeing a different side, a man who had paid a price for his ambition, who had lost something he could never truly replace. "There was someone," he continued, his gaze distant, as though he were looking back at a memory that still haunted him. "She believed in me even when I doubted myself. But I was so focused on building this company, on achieving my goals, that I neglected what mattered most. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. She'd moved on, and I was left with the life I thought I wanted but felt empty inside." Isabel's chest tightened as she absorbed his words. She understood that feeling all too well, the hollow realization that came from sacrificing too much, from letting ambition overshadow the things that truly mattered. She had done the same in a different way, allowing her family's expectations to dictate her life, to trap her in a marriage that left her feeling unfulfilled and unseen. "I'm sorry, Lorenzo," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "It must have been difficult to go through that." He nodded, his expression somber. "It was. And I don't know if I've ever forgiven myself for it, but lately I've been thinking that maybe there's a chance to change, to live differently." Their eyes met, and Isabel felt a surge of warmth, of understanding that went beyond words. In that moment, they were two people stripped of titles and roles, two souls sharing their regrets, their hopes, and the fragile possibility of something new. The connection she felt with Lorenzo was undeniable, a pull that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Lorenzo," she began, her voice hesitant but steady. "I know what it's like to feel trapped in choices you didn't make, to feel like you're living someone else's life. My marriage, it's not what people think it is. It was an arrangement, something my family wanted. And I thought I could make it work. But sometimes it feels like I'm losing myself." She hadn't intended to reveal so much, but the words spilled out, as though a dam had broken inside her. For so long she had carried this weight alone, the quiet despair of a life that felt more like a role she was playing than a life she was truly living. Saying it out loud, especially to Lorenzo, made it feel painfully real, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. Lorenzo's gaze softened, his expression filled with empathy and a quiet understanding that made her feel safe. "Isabel, you deserve to be happy. You deserve to live a life that makes you feel whole, not just accepted." The sincerity in his words touched her deeply, and she felt tears prick her eyes. She looked down, swallowing the lump in her throat, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his voice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." For a moment, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet bound by a shared understanding that words couldn't fully capture. Isabel's heart ached with a mix of emotions: gratitude, yearning, and a growing realization that her feelings for Lorenzo had deepened far beyond admiration. It wasn't just a crush, a fleeting attraction, it was something real, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Lorenzo reached out, his hand covering hers in a gentle, comforting gesture. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, two souls drawn together by something they couldn't explain. "Isabel," he murmured, his voice low, "I don't want to overstep. But I want you to know that I care about you more than I should, perhaps. And if there's ever a time when you need someone, I'm here." Her breath caught, and she felt a surge of emotion that left her speechless. She knew that crossing this line could complicate everything, that it could bring consequences neither of them were prepared to face. But in this moment, with Lorenzo's hand on hers and his eyes filled with a warmth she had longed for, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. "Thank you, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "That means more to me than you know." They sat there in silence, the connection between them deepening with each passing second. It was a fragile moment, a shared vulnerability that felt both dangerous and beautiful. Isabel knew that this was a line she could never uncross, that her heart had already chosen a path that was bound to lead to both joy and heartache. But for now, in this quiet moment of understanding and solace, she allowed herself to simply feel, to let down her walls and embrace the possibility of something more. The days that followed her conversation with Lorenzo felt like a delicate balancing act. Isabel poured herself into her work, trying to ignore the growing feelings within her, the quiet yet insistent presence of Lorenzo in her heart. She knew the risks of what was unfolding between them, the danger of letting her emotions guide her decisions. And yet each day seemed to pull her closer to him, as if an invisible thread bound them together, defying the careful boundaries she had once maintained. At home, her interactions with Jared grew increasingly strained. Their rare conversations had always been polite, distant exchanges, but now Isabel felt a new tension simmering beneath the surface. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the emptiness of their relationship, the quiet frustration of a life that felt like it was slipping away from her. She found herself resentful of the indifference he showed, the way he moved through their shared life as if she were a mere obligation, an accessory to his image. One evening, Isabel returned home to find Jared in the kitchen, something unusual given his typical late nights at work. He was preparing a simple dinner, the silence thick and uncomfortable, as he moved around the space. Isabel paused, surprised to see him there, and for a moment she considered engaging him in conversation, perhaps finding a way to bridge the gap between them. But as she stepped forward, his expression remained distant, his attention focused solely on his task. Sighing, she moved to set her bag down, feeling the weight of unspoken words between them. She had come to realize that Jared's absence in her life was more than physical, it was a choice, a decision he had made long ago, whether consciously or not. He was simply not invested in their marriage, and the realization left her feeling hollow. Without looking up, Jared spoke, his tone neutral. My parents want us to join them for dinner this Friday. Some new business partners will be there, and they want us to make a good impression. Isabel bit back the frustration that surged within her. Their lives had become a series of appearances, meetings, and family gatherings, all carefully orchestrated to maintain the image of a perfect marriage. She felt like a prop in someone else's story, a supporting character in a life that held little meaning for her. I have work on Friday, she replied, trying to keep her tone calm. Lorenzo and I are finishing up the project, and it's an important day for us. Jared looked up, his expression blank but his voice carrying a hint of annoyance. Isabel, it's one dinner. Can't you rearrange your schedule? She forced herself to remain steady, though his words stung. You know how much this project means to me, Jared. I've put a lot of work into it. Besides, you and I both know that your family dinners don't need me to succeed. He frowned, setting down the spoon he'd been holding. Isabel, it's not about the dinner. It's about appearances. This is what we signed up for. You knew that from the beginning. Her patience finally broke, and she met his gaze with a rare firmness. No, Jared, I didn't sign up to be just an accessory. I thought we'd be partners, that we'd have some kind of connection. But all you've ever wanted is someone to stand beside you and smile for the photos. His expression hardened, and he looked away, as though her words had struck a nerve. But he said nothing, and the silence that followed was filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said, the truths they had avoided for far too long. Isabel turned away, gathering her things, her heart heavy with disappointment. She knew she couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a life that felt as hollow as the man she'd married. She was beginning to realize that her loyalty to this marriage had been one-sided, that she had been clinging to a duty that Jared didn't seem to share. The following day, as she sat in her office, Isabel felt the strain of the conversation with Jared still weighing on her. She wanted to confide in someone, to share the pain she felt, but there was only one person she trusted with that part of herself. When Lorenzo appeared at her door later that afternoon, his expression warm and welcoming, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. He seemed to sense her troubled mood, his gaze softening as he stepped inside. Isabel, you all right? He asked, his voice gentle. She managed a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. It's been a tough few days. He sat down across from her, leaning forward, his attention fully on her. Do you want to talk about it? For a moment, she hesitated, uncertain if she should burden him with her personal troubles. But the warmth in his gaze, the quiet understanding he offered, broke down her resolve, and before she knew it, she found herself opening up. It's my marriage, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Jared and I, we're strangers living under the same roof. I thought I could make it work, that we'd find some kind of partnership, but it feels like I'm giving up more of myself every day. Lorenzo listened intently, his expression filled with empathy. He reached out, covering her hand with his own, his touch a comforting weight. You don't deserve that, Isabel, he said softly. You deserve someone who sees you, who values you for who you are. His words sent a rush of warmth through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long. She looked down, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. I know, but sometimes it feels impossible to break away, like I'm bound to this life that doesn't even feel like mine. He tightened his grip on her hand, his gaze unwavering. You're stronger than you realize. You don't have to settle for a life that leaves you empty, Isabel. You have the power to choose to change. Isabel's heart raced at his words, a mixture of fear and hope swirling within her. She knew he was right, but the thought of stepping away, of abandoning the life her family had carefully crafted for her, felt overwhelming. And yet, sitting here with Lorenzo, she felt a courage she hadn't known she possessed, a quiet strength that grew each time he spoke. Thank you, she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't know what I'd do without you. He offered her a small smile, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. You don't have to face this alone, Isabel. I'll be here, whatever you decide. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Isabel felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. With Lorenzo, she felt safe, understood, and seen. He was more than just her boss, he was the one person who had seen past the mask she wore, the one person who had shown her a glimpse of the life she wanted but had never dared to pursue. As the moment lingered between them, Isabel knew she was standing at a crossroads, her heart divided between loyalty and the promise of something real, something that felt like home. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could choose a life that was hers alone. A week after her vulnerable conversation with Lorenzo, Isabel found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Her interactions with him continued to deepen, each conversation feeling like an anchor in the storm of her life. The more she opened up to him, the more she felt seen and valued in ways she hadn't experienced before. But with each new moment they shared, the pull of her feelings grew stronger, blurring the lines between professional respect and something far more profound. One evening, as Isabel stayed late to finish a project, she noticed Lorenzo pacing near his office door. His expression was tense, and he seemed distracted, lost in thoughts that made his usual calm demeanor look frayed at the edges. She hesitated before approaching, feeling a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Lorenzo," she said softly, watching as he turned, his gaze flickering with a mix of relief and vulnerability at the sight of her. "Isabel, I didn't realize anyone was still here," he replied, offering a small, tired smile. "Is everything okay?" she asked, stepping closer, her tone laced with genuine concern. He hesitated, glancing away for a moment as though weighing whether to speak. Then, he sighed, motioning her into his office. Isabel followed, her curiosity growing as he closed the door behind them. She took a seat, watching as he leaned against his desk, rubbing his temples. "I've been struggling with something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically strained. "Something I haven't been fully honest about." Isabel's heart raced, a flicker of apprehension stirring within her. She had grown to trust him deeply, to see him as a constant in her life, but his tone hinted at something serious, something that weighed on him in ways she hadn't seen before. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lorenzo took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers with a mixture of vulnerability and regret. "Isabel, there's something about me that you don't know. Something I should have told you from the beginning." Her pulse quickened, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. 1,000 questions swirled through her thoughts, but she forced herself to remain calm, to listen. He looked away, as though gathering his courage, and then he spoke, his voice laced with hesitation. "My name. It isn't just Lorenzo Bellini. That's a professional identity I've taken on. My real name is Jared." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, her mind struggling to comprehend what he had just said. She stared at him, disbelief and shock flooding her senses. "Jared," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Yes," he admitted, his expression filled with regret. "I am the same Jared you married." Isabel's heart pounded, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as she tried to make sense of the revelation. The man she had fallen for, the man who had made her feel seen, valued, and understood was her husband all along, the same Jared who had always felt distant, detached. She shook her head, her mind reeling. You've been pretending this whole time," she managed, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he replied, his tone pleading. "When we married, I thought I could keep my personal and professional lives separate. I thought I could be the man my family wanted, and still build a life outside of their expectations. So I became Lorenzo, created an identity that let me pursue my ambitions without the baggage of family ties. I never expected you to work here, Isabel. And once you did, I didn't know how to tell you without losing everything." Her mind raced, memories of their moments together flashing before her eyes, every kind word, every gesture, every lingering glance. All of it, she realized, had been entangled in a web of deception. She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of hurt and confusion swirling within her. "You could have told me," she said, her voice breaking. "You let me believe you were two different people. You made me feel like I was finally understood, finally seen. But it was all just a lie." "No," he said, his tone urgent, stepping closer. "It wasn't a lie. I meant every word I said to you, Isabel. Everything I felt for you was real, but I was terrified of what the truth would mean, of losing this connection we'd found." She took a step back, her emotions in turmoil. "You wanted the best of both worlds, Jared. You wanted to live a double life, to play the perfect husband while also being this other man who could offer me everything my husband never did." He looked away, shame flickering in his gaze. "I know I was wrong, and I never should have deceived you. But you have to believe me, Isabel, everything I've said, everything I feel, it's real." Isabel closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had spent so much time feeling trapped, longing for an escape from the life her family had imposed on her. And now, the man she had allowed herself to trust, the man she had fallen for, was the very person she had resented for so long. "Do you have any idea how much you hurt me?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe that I could finally have something real, something meaningful, but you took that away the moment you lied to me." He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers, his expression filled with regret. "Isabel, please. I know I made mistakes, but I want to make this right. I want to be the man you deserve, not just the man my family expects me to be." She looked down, her heart torn between the love she had felt for Lorenzo and the betrayal she felt at Jared's deception. Her mind replayed their conversations, their shared moments, each memory tainted by the knowledge that it had all been built on a lie. "Right now, I don't know if I can trust anything you say," she murmured, pulling her hand away. "I don't even know who you really are." A painful silence settled between them, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. She could see the remorse in his eyes, the regret that lined his features, but it wasn't enough to erase the hurt she felt. She had opened her heart to him, had allowed herself to hope, only to discover that her happiness had been woven into a fabric of deceit. "Isabel," he said, his voice filled with a quiet desperation, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but please let me prove to you that I want to be better, that I want to be the man who can make you truly happy." She shook her head, feeling the walls she had built around her heart fortifying once more. "I don't know if I can give you that chance, Jared. Not after everything." With one last glance, she turned and walked out of his office, her heart heavy and her mind clouded with uncertainty. She had thought she had finally found something real, a connection that could fill the void in her life. But now she was left with nothing but shattered illusions and a betrayal that cut deeper than any she had ever known. As she left the building, the cool night air stung her skin, grounding her in the harsh reality of her situation. The man she had fallen for was the same man she had been bound to by duty, the same man she had believed incapable of offering her the love and understanding she had craved. And now, as the truth lay bare before her, Isabel realized that she was more lost than ever, caught between the life she had tried to escape and the life she had dared to hope for. The days following the revelation felt like a blur for Isabel, each one blending into the next as she struggled to reconcile the truth. The shock of discovering Lorenzo's true identity Jared left her feeling fractured, as if everything she had believed in had been uprooted. She went about her work mechanically, avoiding his gaze, dodging his attempts to speak with her. The hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too deep, and every time she saw him, a mix of anger and longing twisted inside her. By the end of the week, a reminder arrived that felt almost like a cruel joke. Her parents were hosting their anniversary celebration, a grand event they had been planning for months. Jared was expected to be by her side, the dutiful husband, as they presented the image of the perfect couple to family and friends. The very thought of attending, of smiling and pretending to be happy, made her stomach churn. But she knew her absence would raise questions, and the pressure from her family weighed heavily on her. The evening of the anniversary arrived far too quickly. Isabel dressed slowly, each piece of jewelry and every swipe of makeup feeling like another layer of armor she had to put on to face the evening. She chose a deep emerald dress that hugged her frame elegantly, the color striking against her skin. It was a dress Jared had once complimented her on, though he had barely noticed when she had worn it before. When she emerged from the bedroom, Jared Lorenzo was already waiting in the living room, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked up as she entered, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her pulse quicken, despite the resentment she felt. "You look beautiful, Isabel," he said softly, his voice laced with a mixture of regret and admiration. She looked away, her voice flat. "Let's just get through this evening." The drive to her parents' estate was quiet, the silence filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. As they pulled up to the grand entrance, Isabel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the evening ahead. The moment they stepped out of the car, the flashing cameras and warm smiles of relatives enveloped them. Jared instinctively placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture she had once found comforting, but now it only served as a reminder of the complicated truth between them. Inside, the estate was decorated in lush gold and white, with twinkling chandeliers casting a warm glow over the guests. Isabel forced herself to smile, nodding politely to her parents, friends, and acquaintances, her hand brushing Jared's as they walked. She felt the weight of their family's expectations pressing down on her, reminding her of the life she had been bound to, a life that felt increasingly suffocating with each passing minute. As they moved through the crowd, Jared leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Isabel, please. Can we talk? Even just for a moment." She stiffened but nodded, not wanting to draw attention. They found a quiet alcove near the balcony, away from the watchful eyes of family and guests. Jared turned to her, his expression earnest, desperation flickering in his gaze. "Isabel, I know I've hurt you," he began, his voice filled with remorse. "I never intended for things to end up like this. But I'm trying to be honest with you now, to make things right." She crossed her arms, her gaze hard. "Why should I believe anything you say? You've lied to me from the beginning. You made me believe you were someone else, someone I could trust." His face softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I understand why you feel that way, but everything I've said to you, everything I felt, it was real, Isabel. Even if my name wasn't. I fell in love with you, not as the woman I was arranged to marry, but as the person I got to know here at work." The words struck a chord within her, but she fought to keep her emotions in check. "You didn't give me a choice, Jared. You took away my ability to decide for myself. I was vulnerable, and you used that." He reached out, gently touching her arm, his voice pleading. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but please, let me show you that I can be the husband you deserve. I want to build something real with you, not just for our families, but for us." She looked down, her mind spinning with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long feeling alone, isolated in her marriage, and Lorenzo Jared had awakened something within her, a hope she hadn't felt in years. But how could she trust that his words were true, that he wouldn't betray her again? "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why wait until now to tell me the truth?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that if I told you, I would lose you. But I realize now that I was wrong. You deserve honesty, Isabel, even if it's painful." They stood there in silence, the sounds of the celebration echoing around them as they lingered in their private corner. Part of her wanted to believe him, to take the chance and rebuild something from the ashes of their broken trust. But another part, the part that had been hurt and deceived, held her back, reminding her of the risks. "Isabel, I'm asking you to give me one last chance," Jared said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "Come with me to our family's cabin next weekend. Just the two of us. Let's try to rebuild, to see if there's something worth saving. If you still want to leave after that, I won't stop you." She hesitated, her mind racing. The cabin was a place she had heard of but had never been to, a secluded spot away from the pressures and expectations of their families. It was tempting, the idea of escaping the prying eyes, the obligations. And deep down, she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them beyond the betrayal. "All right," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "One weekend. But I'm not promising anything, Jared." A flicker of hope lit up his eyes, and he nodded, a small, relieved smile crossing his face. "That's all I ask." They returned to the party, their silent truce lingering between them as they fell back into the roles expected of them. Isabel moved through the evening, her heart heavy but a sliver of hope glimmering within her. For so long she had believed that her marriage was nothing more than a duty, a role she had to fulfill. But now, as they left the event and drove home in silence, she found herself wondering if there was a chance for something real, something that might finally make her feel whole. Yet the uncertainty gnawed at her, the fear of opening her heart again only to have it broken once more. She knew that this weekend would be a turning point, a moment where she would finally have to confront the truth of her feelings and decide whether she could forgive him. As she lay in bed that night, Isabel stared into the darkness, her mind consumed by questions she couldn't answer. She had always been bound by duty, by the expectations of her family and the life they had built for her. But this decision, this chance to choose for herself, felt like the most important choice she would ever make. And as she drifted into a fitful sleep, Isabel knew that whatever lay ahead, it would change her life forever. The weekend arrived, and as Isabel drove toward the cabin with Jared by her side, a sense of unease filled the car. They had spoken little since the anniversary party, each lost in their own thoughts, both aware of the significance of this trip. The trees lining the road grew denser, the landscape transforming into a secluded, serene space away from the prying eyes and expectations of their families. Isabel stared out the window, her heart heavy with doubt, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. When they finally reached the cabin, Jared helped her with her bags, his movements quiet and careful, as though he feared breaking the fragile truce between them. The cabin was simple yet charming, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of a sparkling lake just beyond the trees. It felt like a world apart from the life they had been living, a life filled with obligations, appearances, and masks. They settled in, each unpacking their belongings in silence. Jared suggested they take a walk by the lake, and Isabel agreed, hoping the fresh air might help clear her thoughts. As they walked, the only sounds were the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the gentle rustling of the trees. Finally, Jared broke the silence. "Isabel," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I want you to know that I'm here to be as honest as I can. I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious about this. About us." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words, but also the lingering hurt that had taken root in her heart. It's hard to believe anything, Jared. I thought I knew you, that we were finally building something real. And then, to find out that you were pretending this whole time, it feels like I've been betrayed twice over." He paused, looking out over the lake, his expression filled with regret. "I know, and I can't undo the mistakes I've made. But please, give me this chance to show you who I really am, the man I want to be for you." They continued walking until they reached a small clearing by the lake, where they sat on a large rock overlooking the water. Jared glanced at her, his eyes filled with an earnestness she hadn't seen before. "Do you remember why we got married?" he asked, his tone reflective. "Our families made it sound like it was meant to be, like it was fate." Isabel nodded, the memory of their wedding day flashing through her mind, two strangers bound by family expectations, stepping into a life neither had chosen. "Yes, but it always felt like it was more about them than about us. We were just fulfilling a role." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I felt that way too. That's why I created Lorenzo, this other identity. It was my way of escaping the weight of my family's expectations. But when you started working with me, I didn't know how to tell you, and then it was too late. I was trapped in my own web of lies." She looked down, tracing a finger over the rough surface of the rock. "But you still could have told me. Instead, you let me believe in a version of you that wasn't real." He reached out, hesitating before gently placing his hand over hers. "Isabel, I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to build something true with you, without the lies, without the masks." A silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Isabel took a deep breath, feeling the sting of his betrayal but also the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. "You say you want to be honest, but I need to understand why, Jared. Why did you choose to live this double life? Was it really just about escaping our families?" He looked away, his expression pained. "In the beginning, yes. But then I started to feel something real with you, something I hadn't expected. I realized that the only way I could be with you was if I let go of everything that had been holding me back." Isabel felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a sliver of understanding. She could see the remorse in his eyes, the regret that lined his face. "You took that choice away from me, Jared. You made me fall in love with a version of you that didn't exist. How do I know that you won't deceive me again?" He swallowed, his gaze steady. "You don't. But I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm committed to us, to this marriage. No more lies, no more pretending." They sat in silence, watching as the sun dipped lower over the lake, casting a golden glow across the water. Isabel's heart felt torn, divided between the pain of the past and the hope for a future that could be different. She had spent so much of her life living up to others' expectations, trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. And now, here was Jared, offering her a chance at something real, something that felt terrifyingly vulnerable but also filled with potential. "Jared," she said softly, turning to face him, "I need time. I need to know that this is more than just words, that you're truly willing to be honest with me, to let go of everything that held us back." He nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "I'll give you all the time you need. I just hope that one day you'll be able to see me for who I really am, and that maybe you'll let yourself love me." Isabel's heart skipped a beat, his words stirring something deep within her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this could be the beginning of something genuine. But the wounds of betrayal still ached, a reminder of the pain she had endured. She knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, that it would take time to heal the scars that lingered. As the evening drew on, they made their way back to the cabin, each lost in thought, yet bound by the fragile hope of a new beginning. They shared a quiet dinner, the silence between them no longer heavy but filled with a sense of mutual understanding. For the first time, Isabel felt as though they were on equal footing, two people trying to bridge the distance that had separated them for so long. Later, as she lay in bed, Isabel stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. She knew that this weekend was only the beginning, that building trust would require more than just words. But she also knew that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of her fears, that she had to take a chance if she ever wanted to find happiness. The decision wasn't easy, and the path forward felt uncertain. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, Isabel allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild the foundation of their marriage not as strangers, but as two people who had finally chosen each other. As the weekend at the cabin drew to a close, Isabel felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over her. The time spent with Jared, real, honest, and stripped of pretense, had been healing in a way she hadn't anticipated. They had talked late into the night, sharing pieces of themselves that had remained hidden, tucked away under years of duty and the weight of family expectations. For the first time, she felt that she truly knew Jared, not as the man she'd married out of obligation, but as someone who had struggled, grown, and regretted his mistakes. They spent their final morning together quietly, sipping coffee on the cabin's small porch as the sun rose over the lake. The silence between them was no longer filled with tension, but rather a shared understanding of the journey they were on. Isabel could sense Jared's desire to make things right, to start over, and while she hadn't completely healed from the betrayal, she felt a newfound willingness to try. "Thank you for coming here with me," Jared said, breaking the silence, his voice soft. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Isabel glanced at him, offering a small, sincere smile. "I needed this. I needed to see the real you, not the man you thought I wanted." He nodded, his expression one of quiet determination. "I'm done pretending. I just want to be the person you deserve, the person who can support you, understand you, and be there for you." His words lingered, and Isabel felt her heart ache with a mixture of hope and caution. "I want that too," she admitted. "But it's going to take time, Jared. Trust isn't something we can rebuild overnight." He reached out, covering her hand with his own. "I'll wait as long as it takes. I want to prove that I'm here, not just for today or tomorrow, but for whatever comes next." As they packed up their belongings and prepared to leave, Isabel felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over her. She wasn't certain of the future, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the past. For too long she had allowed her life to be defined by her family's expectations, by the roles others had set for her. But now, she wanted something more, something real, something chosen. The drive back to the city was peaceful, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Isabel watched the scenery pass by, her mind replaying the memories of the weekend, the quiet moments and honest conversations. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, doubts, and possibly setbacks. But for the first time, she felt that she was finally living on her own terms. Once they arrived back in the city, Isabel felt a pang of anxiety as they approached the familiar routine that had once felt so stifling. She wasn't sure how their relationship would fit into their regular lives, surrounded by the pressures and expectations they had momentarily escaped. But Jared's steady presence beside her offered a sense of reassurance, a reminder that they were both committed to building something new. A few days later, Isabel found herself back in the office, returning to the familiar tasks of her job. She felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty as she resumed her work, wondering how her colleagues would perceive the subtle changes in her relationship with Jared. It felt strange, this new reality where they were no longer simply playing roles but genuinely trying to connect. That evening, as she finished up her tasks, Jared appeared at her door. He leaned against the frame, his expression warm and open. "Can I take you to dinner tonight?" he asked, his tone casual yet hopeful. Isabel smiled, a genuine warmth filling her heart. "I'd like that." They chose a small, intimate restaurant tucked away from the bustling city streets. Over dinner, They spoke about everything except work or family obligations, sharing dreams, childhood memories, and future aspirations. It was as though they were rediscovering each other, seeing one another with fresh eyes. Isabel felt a quiet thrill, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. At one point during the evening, Jared reached across the table, taking her hand. His gaze was steady, filled with a tenderness that made her heart race. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice low. "But I promise you, Isabel, I'm here for the future. I want us to build something real, something we both choose." She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she nodded, squeezing his hand. "I want that too, Jared. I want to finally live a life that's ours, not just something handed down to us." They left the restaurant that evening hand in hand, walking through the quiet city streets under the glow of the streetlights. Isabel felt a sense of lightness, as if the weight she had been carrying for so long had begun to lift. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt ready to face it, knowing she was no longer alone in this journey. In the following weeks, their lives settled into a new rhythm. They continued to navigate the challenges of their past, the moments of doubt that crept in from time to time, but each day, they made a choice to be open, honest, and present with each other. They began to create memories that were truly theirs: weekend hikes, quiet evenings with takeout, moments of laughter that came easily and naturally. One evening, as they sat together on their apartment balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Jared turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Isabel," he said softly, "I've never thanked you for giving me this second chance, for allowing me to prove myself." She looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. "We both made mistakes, Jared, but I think we're finally learning to live for ourselves, not for anyone else." He nodded, reaching out to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm grateful for every step of it. I'm grateful for you." They sat together in the quiet of the night, the city stretching out before them as they embraced the life they were building together. It wasn't perfect, and there were still scars that would take time to heal, but for the first time, Isabel felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be, no longer bound by duty or expectations, but by a love they had chosen to redefine together. In the weeks and months that followed, they continued to grow, learning how to trust, how to forgive, and how to cherish each other in ways that went beyond obligation. They were partners, not just in name but in spirit, two people who had walked through the fire of mistakes and misunderstandings to find something worth holding on to. And as Isabel looked forward to the future, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together stronger, braver, and bound by a love that had been forged in honesty, vulnerability, and choice.